Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Chaldean Cultural Center weekly discussion series that is hosted in collaboration with U of M Detroit Center, Unique Voices in Films, and CMN TV. And today I have a very interesting guest, Sofia Barbarani. Did I say it right?
Yes, correct.
One of the reasons she's interesting is because she was born in Italy, and she currently lives in Baghdad. So when I saw that, I said, whoa, I have so many questions for her. Hello, Sofia. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, Wam. Thanks for having me.
So you're a journalist?
Yes, that's correct.
And you participated in writing part of a portion of a book for the Lonely Planet that focused on Iraq, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Exactly.
So how long have you been living in Iraq?
So I have been based here permanently, not very long, just over 2 months now, but I have been reporting, I have been sort of going in and out for about 6 or 7 years now. I was based in Erbil, in the capital of the Kurdistan region of Iraq, for 3 years, from 2013 to 2016. And that's where I started. I finished my master's in London and I moved to Erbil in 2013. And I started working there. So that was my my start in the country. And then after that, I sort of moved. I finished in I left in 2016, and I moved to the other side of the world. So I went to Venezuela for a while, and had a bit of a break and worked there. And then I came back, and since I guess 2017, I sort of went in and out. So I would visit Erbil, I would visit Baghdad, I would work for a month, and then leave. And then finally last year, it kind of dawned on me that it just made sense to be based in Baghdad, and so I moved here about 2 months ago.
Okay, so was this due to the assignments that were given to you, or is there something that you have a particular interest that has you based in Iraq? What interest do you have in that region? What is it that connects you to it?
I mean, by far, yeah, the interest that I have in Iraq is what pushed me, definitely what pushed me to come here. Of course, work is part of it. It sort of goes hand in hand. So it felt to me like in order to do my job properly and to really be here and really immerse myself in a country that is so complex and I still have such a small understanding of, it made sense. It made sense to be here. But I would say that aside from work and from my journalism, what really pushed me to move to the region in the first place was more of an academic background. So my master's degree was in Middle Eastern studies, and what I focused on primarily at the time was Kurdistan, the Kurdistan region. And then from there, my interest grew to the rest of Iraq and northeastern Syria as well. And so all of that then became my area of interest in terms of the work that I do as a journalist.
And you mentioned that you cover stories regarding ISIS, and given the time frame that you were working in Iraq, going back and forth, so I'm assuming that you were there during the ISIS's involvement in Iraq and their invasions and stuff. Okay, and
Yeah.
curious, have you had an opportunity to have direct communication with ISIS members?
So I personally have never interviewed a member of ISIS. I have spoken to people who were in contact with them on a daily basis. So whether it be civilians that were living under ISIS control or civilians that were arrested and kept in ISIS jails for months on end. And so through them, I was able to gather quite a relatively good understanding of what was happening. But when it comes to interviewing ISIS members, it's a very gray area. It's a very difficult, I guess, it's not easy to know exactly under what circumstances you're interviewing these individuals, because more often than not, a journalist interviews them when they are being held, whether it's in a prison in the Kurdistan region, a prison in the Kurdish region in Syria, and therefore most likely under incredible strain, probably torture. It's very difficult to know whether you are interviewing someone who is speaking to you because they want to speak to you, or whether they're being coerced into speaking to you. And so as interesting as it would have been, I never really, I guess, got the chance, but I also never really pursued it because I just didn't feel, at the time, I was only 25, 26, I didn't feel ready as a journalist to do that kind of, to carry out that kind of interview.
And what about the people the minority groups that were most affected by ISIS, the Chaldeans, Assyrians, Yazidis, other minorities? Have you had direct contact with them, and what their experiences were like as this was happening in 2014?
Yes, absolutely. I think they were probably the communities that I most spoke to, particularly during my time in Erbil. So I was there in June 2014 when Mosul fell. And so there was, at the time in June, July 2014, you had this huge influx of Christians from in and around Mosul city come into Erbil. And then, of course, in August, the Yazidi villages were targeted as well. And then they came through Erbil too. And then for the next 2-3 years, the focus was very much on what had happened with these individuals. And then in northeastern Syria, which I also focus on, a lot of the stories that I wrote focused on the Syrian community there, also very much under threat by ISIS, particularly in 2015, when dozens of tiny little villages that are sort of nestled along one of the smaller rivers that feeds into the Euphrates. These villages were attacked, and every single villager left, and so these small, lovely little towns were left completely empty, and are still completely empty of this Christian population. And so, yes, I would say that I did focus a lot on these minorities. I think most journalists, especially at the time, did. It was an incredibly important story.
And what is their position now, if you're aware? I know you're now in Baghdad, but since between that time, 2014, and the current situation, I know there was like a lot of refugee camps. I know a lot of them had to go to different countries, but and we also heard that some were trying to return to the villages, and there was in some cases not a possibility of that. What is the current condition right now?
Well, when it comes to the Yazidi population, you're right, and the Christian as well, you're right in saying that a lot of them left the country, particularly, I would say, within the Christian community. There was already a diaspora of Christian and Yazidis, and so a lot of them, I think, were able to join these family members abroad. The ones who remained behind, the vast majority are still in displaced persons camps primarily across the Kurdish region up north. Just a few days ago, the remains of 104 men that were murdered by ISIS in Kujo village in Sinjar were finally returned to their hometown, and they were able to have a proper burial. I mean, this is 7 years on from when the massacre happened. It took forever, and I think for a lot of these families, at least having that closure of seeing their loved ones buried in their own hometown was a step forward. But there is so much there are so many scars that will last forever. And I think the fact that a lot of these communities are unable to return to their hometowns sort of exacerbates their difficulties. And similarly with the Christian communities, I was speaking to a priest from, I believe, Karakosh just a few weeks ago, and he was telling me that the number of civilians that live there now is, not even half of what it used to be, and many are just not willing to return, especially, as long as the security situation is what it is, and it has improved substantially from when ISIS was in power, but it's still not ideal. If you have the means, you will leave the country and provide a better lifestyle for your family. It's just normal.
I know during that time there was a lot of the Muslim community was affected by ISIS as well, in a different way.
Yes.
And with their situation with the Muslim community that were affected by ISIS, how was that response? So did they flee their places and go somewhere else? And did they travel as much, or how was that handled within the Muslim communities that were affected?
It wasn't actually that dissimilar to what happened to other communities. Of course, I mean, they didn't have a direct threat in the same way that, for example, a non-Muslim might have had. But for example, Shia Muslims were regarded in the same way that a non-Muslim was regarded by the Islamic State, by ISIS. A non-believer that had no business being there and had to be expelled. And I remember when I was in Erbil, a lot of the displaced families coming through were not just Christian, were not just Yazidis. They were also Muslims who had no intention of living under this group. They understood early on who they were and what they were going to become and decided to leave. Now, a lot of them, unfortunately, especially in rural Iraq, had very little choice or very, very few options. A lot of them their livelihoods were in the hometowns that were being taken over by ISIS. And if they wanted to continue to provide for their family, they had to stay in those hometowns. They couldn't flee. And so they stayed. Of course, there were ISIS supporters there, and they stayed because they wanted to support ISIS. But there were also people that didn't have the alternative, didn't have the luxury of leaving behind their flock of 200 sheep or their farms or, whatever it is, and go God knows where. And so they were stuck, and they stayed there for 3-4 years.
Yes. So, yeah, I think sometimes people don't see all the communities that were affected because some of them didn't get the same type of media attention, but ISIS really did a lot of damage to the whole country. What you described, I mean, you kind of answered that, but then sometimes here we're in the United States, and Michigan has the largest population of Chaldeans now in the world, given what has happened in Iraq. We used to be the second largest population, but after this incident, we have most of the majority of the population concentrated here. And a strong curiosity to understanding like the future of the Christians in the Middle East, particularly. I mean, this is our birthland, so we would like to have some kind of understanding. And we tried to pick up some information from what the government shares and what the patriarch shares, the Chaldean patriarch. What is your perspective on this? Do you feel like there is a possibility for the Christians who have fled, either to return to their villages or with regards even to visiting Iraq, is there a different type of safety now? Do we need to have the same concerns that maybe it's 6-7 years ago is fairly new, we're not talking about like 20-30 years ago.
Yeah.
So what is your perspective And what would you say to people that want to kind of connect to their homeland, whether they had to flee or whether they want to just visit?
I have to say, I have spoken to very few Christians who haven't said, very few Christians I've spoken to have said that they want to stay in Iraq. Given the opportunity, I think the vast majority would choose to leave the country. Unfortunately, in a way, but also, like I said before, it is completely understandable. And for example, I remember in I guess it was 2014 or 2015, Pope Francis saying, you know, it's such a shame that these communities that really were the core of Iraq and of Syria are fleeing, and you have to stay, you have to be strong, you have to remain and continue this Christian tradition. Sure, that's fine. It's okay to say that from the Vatican, but when you are a father of, you know, 5, and you have a wife, and you want to give them the best possible upbringing, and you get the opportunity, you leave, you go somewhere else. And in terms of security, it's I would say that it has improved since ISIS was, I mean, they were never truly defeated, but they no longer have the territory that they used to have. And so in terms of security, I would strongly recommend for anyone to come and visit Iraq, to be perfectly honest. Always obviously being very careful and taking the right precautions, but it's a country, it's livable. There are cities that are very livable, like Baghdad, like Erbil, and so yes, I am always very much for, I mean, I also wrote the Lonely Planet book I authored the Lonely Planet chapter for Iraq. So I'm all for everyone coming, even as a tourist.
You know, I have to say that I have heard of people that have visited in the last like 3 to 4 years, and they kind of share similar views on this. They went and came back safely, and they said, you know, it's not, as long as you know people there and you know what you're going. But that's the situation. I think no matter when you went to Iraq. When I went in 2000 and visited Iraq, I had to take the same precautions. So that's
exactly.
Yeah. Another thing, question, because I do see that you also have a focus on women, Middle Eastern women, so obviously Iraqi women. And so how would you describe the current, you know, social roles of women compared to, you know, previous position like pre-Saddam, pre-ISIS? How would you describe it, the differences? I know the other day I saw you, I think it was yesterday, you posted a very nice picture of some women doing ballet in Iraq. I think it was in the 1970s. It was a beautiful image. Yeah. So what would you say about that?
I mean, these images I absolutely adore, of women in the 70s and the 60s in Iraq. I also feel like they are very, and rightly so, they're very romanticized. I think for sure women had probably a larger role in some respects in the 70s, in the 80s. But I always wonder, how superficial was it? So, you know, we see these photos of women doing ballet or wearing short skirts or attending university. And so it feels very progressive, absolutely. But it was still the 60s. I mean, Italy in the 60s wasn't progressive when it comes to women. So it's hard to really tell, you know, how far they truly had a role in society. These days, you know, Iraq, the Iraqi parliament does have female members of parliament, but to what extent do they have, you know, do they have power to push sort of pro-women legislation. That's a whole other issue. Domestic abuse laws here are still terrible, and this has become increasingly obvious over the past year during COVID, with when lockdown was in place. The number of reported domestic violence and I think even killings spiked. And so there are still huge issues that need to be dealt with. But there are also some interesting examples. For example, in Fallujah, which is so often regarded as it's Fallujah city in Anbar province, which is where ISIS also kind of first rose to power in early 2014, before Mosul. And so the women there are often regarded as, it's a conservative society, so one assumes that the women stay where the women have to stay and dress a certain way. And but it was interesting for me. I've been going to Fallujah quite regularly since 2017, and what the women there said to me was that there was almost a knee-jerk reaction to what ISIS did to their community. And so post-ISIS, women in Fallujah started having a greater role in the public sphere. You would see more women just out on the street. You would also see more women applying for jobs. The way they were dressing was different. It was almost as though that community decided that what happened under ISIS was too much to bear and that they had to go the opposite way. And so again, I don't know how superficial this is. I'm hoping that it's something that will continue and develop and give women not just more freedom, but more say and more power and more decision-making roles, which is what really needs to happen.
Yeah, that's actually, that's very beautiful what you shared. So my paternal aunt was a midwife in Fallujah. She was a Christian that lived in a community that really loved and honored her. And she worked with major sheikhs and gave birth to a lot of, she went to school for nursing. And so people knew her there. And, what you're saying with regards to things being romanticized versus the reality, I think this is why it's important having people like yourself as a journalist, as a writer, because then you get to investigate that. And it's both, I have my books, I was very specific in choosing covers that dispelled stereotypes of how, my sisters grew up in the 60s and the 70s, and they wore those short skirts and they had those images that you were sharing, and they walked safely in the streets. That doesn't mean that, they had all the same rights or anything like that. You're right. I think the healthiest part is kind of making these observations and seeing that Iraqi women have a lot of inner power, power. There are some limitations, but I think we get to these limitations and we can outgrow them or progress in a lot of ways when we honor both sides, that she is the woman is very strong. I'm so happy when you're saying this about Fallujah, and I can actually see that, because like I said, my aunt had very beautiful relationship living there all that time, and they knew her very well and honored her. And there was no issue of even her being of a different religion. So these stories are important. They just don't get out there enough. That this is the first time I've heard of that, and I read quite a bit. I do a lot of research, and that's the first time I've heard of something like that with regards to Fallujah. And I know that you also offer opportunities for people if they want to connect with you and to freelance and commission your work. And I think anybody who's interested particularly in Iraq and more authentic stories, I really encourage people to reach out to you, to find how they can bring these stories to surface, rather than kind of just, they're always buried. And then we never really get to resolve and heal past that, because they're like so secondary, or we can't even find them. So, and this is why, I have this question for you with regards to, I think it's very beautiful. I think the West and the East can learn so much from each other. And you're an example of that. I'm sure you're being an example of teaching Iraqis a lot of things, and you're learning a lot from them. What do you think the world could learn from Iraq?
On a day-to-day basis, I am learning so much from living in Iraq. And one of the things that I am still learning and will probably be learning for a very long time to come is patience and slowing down. Uh, the ability of the Iraqi to deal with a city in Baghdad and a country that is so often dysfunctional and therefore slow, the ability to deal with that in a patient and almost nonchalant way. It's sad on the one hand because that's what it's come to, but it's also a skill. It's a skill that will serve them in many other parts of their life. And as a Westerner and as someone who lived in big cities, especially London, where everything is just go, 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 moving here and really, truly trying to just slow down and accept things. It sounds very cliche and a bit silly, but I really think that that's something that
It's very important. Yeah, that is a skill. And the faster we go, I think the more we need to learn it. Because, we could, I think,
yeah.
more successful at the end than rushing. There's a saying, the faster you go, the more you fall behind. So what do you think that the Iraqis and the Arab world in general can learn from Westerners?
What can Iraqis learn from Westerners? I think that more than what can they learn from Westerners, I feel like the things that Iraqis are, I guess, lacking are not a result of them as people, but a result of a dysfunctional government that is unable to give them the things that I don't know, for example, just being able to be on time, for example. I mean, that's something that, again, it's a result of a country that doesn't adhere to the same, that doesn't work in so many ways. And I don't know if I'm explaining myself very well. I just don't feel like they are lacking necessarily. It's what has been taken from them because of what's happened over the past 20 years and because of the governments that they have had. And again, maybe I am romanticizing Iraqis too much, and I'm sure that they have many flaws and that they could learn a lot from the West. But the way I see it is that they just have had the most immense bad luck when it comes to who rules over them, and as a result, there are flaws. Yeah, but I think if Iraq and Iraqis had a functioning government, a functioning country, it would be just the absolute most amazing place on earth. It already is, but it would just be beyond.
Yes, and I see what you're saying, because I think if you look in Iraq's history, I mean, they've suffered for hundreds and thousands of years. There's been just like oppression and persecution, and there's just so much war, and that land has gone through quite a bit. So maybe once they get past that and they get the help that they need, the necessities from their government, then they can kind of then look within and
the basics.
The basics. That's what you're trying to say, because I know we were talking about electricity, just as a small example. I think that's just once people have the basics, and they can really grow and flourish. So
yeah, absolutely.
So much, Sofia. I've really enjoyed having you. And if people
Thank you, Wim.
What is the best way to do that?
To connect either through Twitter, or my website has a contact form as well, or a page that can just it emails me. So
yes,
yeah, that's Sofia Barbarani.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, you write stories particularly, and you're there. So if anybody's interested in these stories, yes, with her and that. So thank you. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Wim. Thank you.
Watching. Bye-bye.